Week 30 Overview Carter's Malaise. This week's focus is the second half of the 1970s into early 1980. Gerald Ford narrowly lost the 1976 presidential election to Jimmy Carter, the governor of Georgia. Carter had a winning personality and a genial smile. He seemed like an honest man, a self-proclaimed born-again Christian. With the economy in a depressing slump, energy concerns rising, and cynicism about government at all-time highs, Americans were looking for something new. A slim majority of voters thought an outsider with no taint of Watergate was just what the country needed. Your children will learn about Carter's single administration this week as they get a feel for the era as a whole, the age of mood rings, leisure suits, digital watches, and gasoline rationing. It was a time when a number of the themes that we've studied since the 1960s came to their conclusion. The long saga of the Vietnam War was finally over. The struggle for civil rights for blacks finally settled into a more equal America in the 1970s. The sexual revolution of the 1960s and the energy of the women's movement was mostly spent by the end of the 1970s. And the hippie counterculture turned into the me generation as the radical students of the 60s grew up and settled down. Jimmy Carter was born in the tiny town of Plains, Georgia, in 1924. He trained to be an engineer on the coming generation of nuclear submarines, which he expected to be the heart of the new Navy. But when his father died in 1953, he resigned his commission and came home to take over the family peanut farm. As a young man, Jimmy once heard a preacher ask, "If you were arrested for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you?" From that point out, he was outspoken about his faith, even when he went into politics. He was elected to the Georgia Senate and then served as governor of Georgia from 1971 to 1975. When Carter ran for president in 1976, it wasn't easy for this Southern Baptist to win the nomination. Carter used the Democrats' new post-Watergate primary system to advantage, winning pluralities in a crowded field. As opponents began to drop out of the race, many in the party tried to block him, fearing Carter would be too conservative. Carter tried to keep the liberals on board. He promised the teachers' union that he would create a federal Department of Education. He assured the feminists that even though he was personally opposed to abortion, he would appoint judges who would uphold Roe v. Wade. In the end, Carter secured the nomination and then went on to defeat Gerald Ford. Carter wasn't just a peanut farmer. He was an experienced politician with a background in energy and engineering. He created the U.S. Department of Energy and emphasized conservation as his primary energy policy. He encouraged Americans to turn thermostats down in their homes and set the example by putting on a sweater as he turned down the temperature of the White House. Carter was in favor of nuclear power and other alternatives to oil, but the American nuclear power industry was effectively crippled during his presidency. Many Americans feared that nuclear plants would explode or leak invisible radiation. 65,000 people marched in Washington to protest the use of nuclear power, and then 200,000 people attended a No Nukes concert in New York City. Nuclear power became politically radioactive, and politicians scrambled to get on the winning side of the issue. Despite the still rising cost of oil, regulators stepped in to impose new safety requirements, and opponents mobilized to block new plants through legal means. 51 plants that were in the process of construction were abandoned. Nuclear energy was no longer a viable option in 20th century America. Carter's passion for energy policy was matched by his concern for human rights. He believed it was morally wrong for the United States to help leaders who violated the rights of their citizens. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. had supported a number of unsavory regimes for strategic reasons. Carter cut off aid to countries like Iran, Argentina, Ethiopia, Uruguay, and Nicaragua, all run by oppressive dictators. That choice had serious consequences. For example, the Shah of Iran depended on his secret police to quiet opposition to his rule. His White Revolution was intended to modernize the ancient land of Persia, but it upset tradition and angered people who had prospered under the old ways. Many Iranian Muslims saw increased secularization as a threat to the religious values of their society. Opposition to the Shah grew into revolution. In January 1979, the Shah left Iran for what was called a brief vacation to the United States, from which he never returned. As soon as he left the country, violence erupted between his supporters and various factions of his opposition. Ayatollah Khomeini, who we encountered last week, returned from his exile in Iraq and immediately set up a provisional government. He named himself the supreme leader, the representative of Allah in Iran. Khomeini formed the Islamic Revolutionary Council, consisting of himself and the mullahs, Shia religious officials, who supported him. His new revolutionary courts began to judge and execute members of the old regime. Khomeini declared Iran an Islamic republic on April 1, 1979, rooting both government and society in Islamic principles and practices. And revolutionary Iranians stormed the U.S. embassy and seized more than 50 hostages. Carter launched a military rescue attempt which failed badly, leaving the hostages trapped in Iran. The new rulers of Iran wanted to spread their revolution to neighboring lands, especially Iraq, which had just been taken over by a leader named Saddam Hussein, a man with an ambition to lead the entire Arab world. Saddam's Ba'ath Party was the political opposite of the new Iranian government. The Baathists wanted to unite the Middle East around Arab nationalism, not Shiite fundamentalism. Iran secretly funded Shiite groups in Iraq, including one which tried to assassinate an Iraqi official. That gave Saddam a reason to attack Iran, and he launched a full-scale invasion in September 1980. The U.S. didn't object to Saddam's attack. By this time, Iran had been holding the American hostages for almost a year. Carter's apparent helplessness in the face of this hostage crisis, plus the never-ending economic crisis, did him in politically. We learned about stagflation last week, the new, disturbing combination of rising prices and falling jobs. Carter inherited this problem from Nixon and Ford and wasn't able to solve it any better than they had. Americans became increasingly frustrated with the economy. There seemed to be no end to the economic problems in sight. On July 15, 1979, Carter gave the most important speech of his presidency, and it cost him. In what is known as his malaise speech, he claimed that there was a crisis of confidence in America. He first criticized himself and then his fellow Americans. Carter pointed out the problem of materialism, saying, "Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns." The initial reaction to the speech was positive, but it soon soured. Basically, Americans want leaders who solve their problems, not leaders who blame the problems on the voters. With all the problems in the Carter administration, there were some real successes. The most notable is probably the Camp David peace accords, which normalized relations between Israel and Egypt. Israel and Egypt had technically been in a state of war since the day of Israel's independence back in 1948. They had signed various armistices at the end of active hostilities, but Egypt, like the rest of the Arab nations, refused to even recognize Israel as a nation. The possibility of a breakthrough emerged when the Egyptian president, Anwar el-Sadat, asked to meet with Israel and to address the Israeli parliament in 1978. That led to a series of negotiations between Sadat and Israel's prime minister, Menachem Begin. This enraged other Arab leaders, who condemned Sadat's overtures to Israel. With so much opposition and so much at stake, the Egyptian-Israeli negotiations ground to a halt. President Carter invited both leaders to Camp David, a presidential retreat in rural Maryland. There, Carter mediated negotiations between two men who started off with no flexibility, no expectation of success, and very little willingness to even try to work towards each other. "It was mean," Carter told his wife, Rosalind. "They were brutal with each other, personal." Carter kept them at it for 12 days, through a combination of personal appeals and sheer determination. In the end, the former enemies signed two peace documents, one outlining peace between Israel and Egypt, while the other laid out steps towards lasting peace in the Middle East. Carter also negotiated a new round of strategic arms limitations with the Soviet Union, but his effort to reduce nuclear arms fell apart when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Carter's response to this act of aggression was characteristic. Instead of calling Russia an evil empire or meeting force with force, Carter announced a boycott of the 1980 Olympics, which were to be held in Moscow, and he cut off U.S. grain shipments to Russia. As he entered the 1980 presidential election race, Carter faced a 25% approval rating, which was lower than Richard Nixon's had been at the height of the Watergate scandal. His Republican opponent, Ronald Reagan, asked Americans one question: "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" A majority of voters in 44 states responded no, and the Carter administration was history.